Hello and welcome back. This is the week 14 lecture. So now that we are finally finished with our second critical response, we can move on to our final assignment of the semester, our final paper, which is going to be longer and more in-depth than what we've done previously. So I wanted to sort of start the process this week. We're going to approach our final paper in phases. We're going to break it down into several steps because, like I said, it's a big assignment. It's our final assignment. We don't have a midterm or a final exam in this class, as we know. So this final paper is worth a lot of points. It's the biggest assignment of the semester. It's kind of what we've been working up to throughout the semester. So it's going to be similar to our critical responses in that we are going to be conducting literary analysis. Once again, we will be analyzing literary texts and attempting to interpret them, attempting to make original arguments about them, but a few different things this time. Number one, you get to choose the text that you write about, you choose the text that you analyze, and also we're going to be doing a little bit of research this time. We're going to be conducting some outside research. We're going to find a couple of sources that can help us on the paper, and we have not done that previously. In fact, I have specifically asked you guys not to do research on our previous assignments, but now that is part of the requirement. We need to find some support for our claims, just like we've done before. If you remember English 102, the argumentative research paper that you most likely, hopefully, wrote in that class, similar in nature to what we're going to be doing in here, except now our subject matter is a little bit different. We're making arguments about literary text, but just like before, we have to support those arguments. We need to make those arguments well-developed, persuasive, and a good way to do that is to bring in some sources to help us. So we'll be talking a little bit about research today. And I also want to just talk a little bit about step one or phase one of the final paper writing process, because I really do want you guys to think about this final paper as a process, not something that you can sit down and do in a single day or a single night. I understand that some of our previous assignments have perhaps been like that because they've been relatively short. Our critical responses were relatively short. Obviously, the alternative medias were short. Our discussion posts don't take very long to write. So a lot of our assignments have been things that you could probably do in a single sitting, maybe over the course of an hour, a couple of hours, and that's fine for short essays. But what we're doing now is not a short essay, so we have to spend more time on it, and I want us to approach it as something that's going to take us the better part of 2 weeks, maybe 2.5 weeks. If you guys look ahead to the schedule, you'll see that the final drafts of our final paper will be due, I think, on May 19th, which is the Thursday of exam week. So we're obviously nearing the end of the semester here. This is week 14. We have 2 weeks left of instruction. So we have week 14 and week 15. After next week, classes are over and we start exam week. So we don't have a final exam, of course. So all we have to do during exam week is submit the final draft of the paper. And I do believe that's the 19th, which is the Thursday of that week. So you have this week to get started on the assignment. You have next week to do the bulk of the writing. I want next week to be a writing week for us, and we will be writing rough drafts first. And then we can use the end of next week and the early part of exam week to turn our rough drafts into final drafts. We'll be revising and editing hopefully by then. And at that point, you guys will be ready to submit. So, our sole focus from this point on is on the final paper. So let's start by talking a little bit about the text that you choose to write about. So I am giving you guys a lot of freedom, which is a little bit frightening. In the past, at least with the critical responses, I've made you choose from one of the texts that I have posted that I've made available for us to read this semester as examples of the major genres of literature. And I think we've done pretty well with that. I've tried to provide a wide variety of different kinds of literary texts, some older, some newer, different subject matters, different styles, trying to ensure that everybody can find at least one or two texts that they actually like. But of course, it is difficult for me to pick things that you guys are going to like because I don't know exactly what you like. I don't really know your literary tastes. So I'm somewhat limited when I choose for you. I can only do so much. So one of the things we're doing different now on this assignment is I want you guys to choose your own text to write about, to analyze, to interpret, to make an argument about. So this is kind of a challenge. I don't want you to look at it like, oh, he's making it easier now, like he's sort of lowering the standards or whatever. I just want us to achieve a maximum level of engagement on this final paper. I really want you guys to be able to write about texts that you like, texts that you have real affection for, texts that you are interested in, you think they're really good, because that just generally leads to better work. If you're writing about a text that, you thought it was okay, it was the best available thing that week, it was okay, but you're not passionate about it, often the literary analysis that comes out of that is going to be kind of uninspired, sort of ho-hum, not anything distinctive or out of the ordinary. But if you're working with a text that you really are connected to, a text that you care about, it means something to you, that usually results in better work. And it's just more fun for each individual writer if you are working with something that you care about. So I really want us to spend a lot of time this week thinking about our choice, thinking about our choice of text, because I don't want you to rush into an immediate decision. I don't want you to pick the first thing that comes to mind, and I definitely don't want you to pick a text primarily because you think it would be an easy text to write about. So of course I do see this every semester. I see a lot of students picking what shall we call them? I guess just like sort of classic, well-known American literary texts. Things that get taught in school a lot. I don't think I need to give you guys examples. Stuff that you read in high school. Famous short stories, famous novels, famous poems. Again, often written by famous American authors like John Steinbeck or Ernest Hemingway. Things that a lot of us maybe read in, previous years, in previous classes, and maybe we even wrote a paper on it back in high school or in some previous English class. So I see this every semester. I see a lot of classic literary texts that are certainly good texts, but I see them selected by students not because the students like them, not because the students care about them, but because the students think, hey, if I pick Of Mice and Men, I'll be able to find a ton of stuff online about it. I won't even need to read it myself. I can just find summaries. And, I read it 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I kind of remember it. I'll refresh my memory with a quick Google search, find a couple of websites, and then I'm good to go. That's not going to work for this paper. And if that's your approach and you're just sort of recycling a lot of really familiar interpretations of these well-known texts, then as we may have seen before on some of our critical responses, that's just not going to result in a good paper. That's not going to result in an original argument. Maybe it was original 20 years ago when all those other people made it, but now if you recycle it, it's not going to really do a whole lot. So that's the problem with really famous, really well-known and often taught texts. You guys might begin to realize that, a lot of that stuff has been written about so much. Even the Hemingway short story that I posted for us, it's been written about so much. It's been talked about and analyzed and interpreted so much that it really is kind of difficult for us to find a lot of original things to say about it. Not impossible. It's never impossible. You can always come up with an original reading or interpretation of a text because each person is an individual. Each person reads a little bit differently. Each person has different ideas. But if we're just recycling all the old ideas that are already out there about these really well-known texts, like I said, that's just not going to lead to successful work. So every semester, I see people writing about, the Grapes of Wrath or 1984. It's like a high school reading list. It's all the books and all the stuff that we did in high school. Maybe Romeo and Juliet, something else that we probably had to read before. And if you guys are passionate about one of those texts, if you care a lot about one of those texts, I'm not going to tell you not to do it. I'm just going to say make your choice for the right reason. Don't pick a text because it seems easy, or because you've read it before or written about it before, or because you think you can find a bunch of summaries and a bunch of explanations of it online. You undoubtedly can, and that's part of the problem. You're going to have a tough time saying anything original because so much has already been said. All right, so my recommendation is really to pick something that you like first and foremost. You don't have to worry if it's some well-known, really celebrated, critically acclaimed text. That doesn't really matter for this assignment. These can be popular texts. These can be books written for young adults. These can be very contemporary texts that maybe a lot of people don't know about yet. It's fine. It doesn't really matter what the reputation is or what the genre is or the time period in which it was written. If you like it, if you have ideas about it, if you want to pursue it, and if you want to work with it more, you should choose it. Because that's something that you can actually enjoy doing, and if you're interested, you'll do better work. So we're going to start by just thinking about our traditional literary genres or categories that we've been talking about throughout the semester. But we can also open things up a little bit, because one thing we've also mentioned this semester is the fact that the definitions of literature have changed a little bit. They are beginning to change a little bit in our current day. We're starting to look at other types of texts in ways that were previously reserved for literature only. And we're starting to see the ways that other texts are similar to literature, and we can use a lot of our tools of analysis that we've developed for literature. We can use those for some other types of texts that maybe have not been traditionally considered to be literature. So we're opening things up. We're a little more flexible, but we do still have some limits as far as what we can choose and what our options are. So let me just run through a quick list here. And I've also posted this in the Week 14 module. So we can obviously choose any work of fiction. That means any novel or short story. So that was our first major literary category that we talked about. So we haven't actually read an entire novel in this class. We probably should have, but we just stuck to short stories and excerpts from novels. But if you guys want to tackle an entire novel, that's fine. And again, don't think that it has to be some classic like War and Peace. Remember, I gave you a chapter from War and Peace to read. That's a very famous novel from the 1800s, but you don't have to pick something like that. You can pick a novel that's a lot more contemporary, a lot more sort of popular in our current modern day culture. You could do a Harry Potter book. Like I said, you could do young adult novels. Those are fair game. That's still literature. They still have the same elements. They still have a lot of the same stuff that we've been talking about and that we did talk about with fiction. So any novel's fair game. It can be old, it can be new, it can be intended for young adults or old people. It doesn't matter. But again, it needs to be a novel that you know and like and care about. So just a quick reminder, just to make sure I say this, no matter what you choose, it would be a great idea to choose something that you've already read and that you're already familiar with. So I know some of you like to read for pleasure. You read in your free time. So if you've read a novel for fun, something over the summer, just something that you like, that's a good choice right there, especially if you've read it relatively recently. Now, we will return to the text, and we might need to reread it this week, or at least reread parts of it, but it's certainly always great to choose a text that you are already familiar with. So any novel, but also short stories are fair game. We read several short stories. We've written about several short stories. So now you can go and look for more. I know as regular people, regular readers, we tend to read short stories less often than we read novels. But there's lots of short story collections out there. So if there's a particular author that you like, you might want to search to see if they do short stories. You might just want to type in best American short stories for a recent year. You'll get all kinds of results just doing a simple Google search like that. Best American short stories of 2021. You'll get a bunch of stuff that you can go and look for, and you'll probably be able to read a lot of them online. So of course it's your responsibility to find these texts. If you don't already own them, you have to find them, and a lot of short stories are available to read online. So you could do an individual short story. I would recommend, if you're going to do that, choosing a somewhat lengthy short story, one that's at least 5-6 pages for a paper like this. If it's a super short story, you might not have quite enough to work with, but 5, 6, close to 10, or anything beyond would probably work. But you could also do a collection of short stories, especially if all the short stories are kind of related, connected in some ways. Diaz has a collection like that. We read Nilda, which was one piece from a collection of short stories that he published, and all the stories were kind of related. A lot of the same characters showed up in multiple stories. So a lot of authors do that. You can find a lot of collections like that from contemporary times, or you can go back to previous decades, whatever you want to do. So novels, short stories are obviously fair game. Also poetry. That was our second big literary category, and the same rule for short stories also applies to poetry. You can do an individual poem. If it's a really short lyric poem, you might think twice about tackling Nothing But It, because, like I said before, it might not give you quite enough material to work with. But if it's kind of a lengthy poem, or like a narrative poem, which are sometimes pretty long, that might be fine. But you could also do a collection of poetry, and you could talk about multiple texts within that collection. That's going to be, in some ways, a little bit trickier, because you're going to have to narrow your focus. You probably can't cover everything in the collection. You might want to grab a handful of pieces, and they need to be linked together, or they need to have at least some similarities so you can bring them together in the paper. But you can certainly do that with poems, or again, just tackle one poem if you think it gives you enough. Also, plays. We talked about drama as our third big category. So you can do plays, and the cool thing about plays, of course, is that you can watch them, in many cases be performed, and then I also would like you to get your hands on the script itself, so you can actually read it. But plays are also options. So those are the things that we've spent most of the semester talking about. But like I said, I'll open this up a little bit. I want to confine us to written texts. or at least in the case of a play, something that was written first and then later performed, through transformation, like we talked about. But I'm gonna just, we're going to stick to the written word and written texts here. So all of our traditional categories, and then a few other things that are increasingly considered to be literature or literature adjacent nowadays. Okay, starting with creative nonfiction. I don't know if we're all familiar with this term, but this has become a pretty popular style of writing. So traditionally there was a hard line, between fiction and nonfiction. Fiction, in a broader sense, can just refer to all literary texts because they tend to be made up, and then on the other side you have nonfiction, which would be like works of history or biography, things that were supposed to be true, factual. But now, frankly, that line can be a little blurry at times, and we have this whole concept of creative nonfiction where, the stories are true, or at least mostly true, but the authors will use a certain amount of artistic license, and they'll incorporate a lot of literary elements, a lot of the things that we would expect to find in a novel or a short story or maybe even a poem will show up in something that is real, and the people in it might be real people, but it still reads a lot like literature. It still reads a lot like creative writing. So you guys might be familiar with some examples of this. It's, like I said, it's pretty popular now. A lot of times it's kind of a broad category. It can include stuff like memoirs, people writing about their lives, but they can do that often in very creative ways. Also, like travel narratives, if you guys have ever come across those are pretty popular amongst a certain segment of the reading public. So like stories about going to places and like maybe going on like expeditions, hiking up Mount Everest or something, like those can often qualify as creative nonfiction because, somebody might be writing about a real experience that they had or documenting a real expedition that took place, but the way they're telling the story, the way it's presented kind of feels like literature. Again, it kind of feels creative. So you could use a book like that. Also, graphic novels or comics. I know those are sometimes used interchangeably. Other times they're thought of as two separate classifications, but we can also consider those because those are written texts and they're increasingly being considered as forms of literature. Of course, they often have visual components, which makes them a little bit different from some of the other categories here, but I would accept those for this assignment, graphic novels or comic books, also works of history. So we talked a little bit about this recently with New Historicism, one of our final critical approaches, and we talked about how one of the big sort of ideas or like driving ideas behind that particular approach is just the similarities between literature and history. How we can analyze history in much the same way that we analyze literature. History has characters and a plot, and it often has themes. But history is also, like literature, maybe a little bit open to interpretation at times. And maybe it's not always giving us just one set, eternal meaning. So this idea that history can sometimes be a little unstable, just like literary texts can be, or they can at least be a little bit open to interpretation. So a history book, some kind of historical account, could actually work for this assignment if you have the time to read it. And then finally, a song could work. But let me just give you a caveat there. You could use a song, but not just any song. Okay, I don't mean to discriminate against a lot of popular music, but you would need to pick sort of a lengthy, lyric-heavy song, if that makes sense. Maybe not your typical, pop hit from the radio. Not that those aren't good songs, but just a lot of those tend to be relatively short. And while they do have lyrics, obviously, often they don't maybe have a lot of lyrics. They might just have a few verses, and then they just have like a really catchy chorus, and there's just really not a whole lot of words ultimately to analyze. So if you're going to do a song, you really need to think about sort of like famous singer-songwriters or anybody who sort of practices a more narrative style of songwriting. Somebody like Bob Dylan, who, really we can analyze a lot of his songs like they're poems because they structurally, they really do have a lot in common with just traditional poetry. And as we saw with our poetry unit, there's always been a connection between poetry and music. So songs that have a lot of lyrics, songs that really have a focus on words, we can obviously read them like poems. So certain songs would work for this assignment. A 2.5 minute pop song that's mostly just about the chorus, probably not going to work unless you think it has a really deep hidden meaning that's very profound that nobody's noticed before. And hey, I've seen some really interesting work done with some popular music, and that's exactly what the students did, is they tried to uncover sort of hidden meaning, stuff that a lot of people didn't see. But unless you think you can do that, you need to pick a lengthy, wordy song. But again, those kinds of songs do work pretty well because we can analyze them like poems. So I think that's my list. Those are the types of texts that we can consider when we're choosing. Now, again, you need to choose one text unless you're going to do a collection of short poems or a collection of short stories. Otherwise, just choose one and just make sure that you have some things to say about it. Again, don't pick it because it seems easy. Don't pick it because other people have picked it. Pick it because you have personal interest and some kind of like personal investment in it. Either you can think it means something really interesting or important, or you can just think it's really well done. You can think there's a lot there to analyze, a lot of elements. Again, by now, you guys know what we're looking for, right? You know a lot about the different literary elements that we've studied throughout the semester. So use some of your past experience when you're, choosing. Use your best judgment. Choose something that gives you a lot to analyze. It's somewhat complex. It's got a lot of characters. It's got a lot of imagery. It has a theme that we can really dig into and think about at length. Try to consider that, things like that when you're choosing. So just spend a little bit of time. And again, if you like to read, this really won't be hard. You can go back to something that you've read recently, something that you enjoyed. Now, if you don't really like to read for pleasure, if you don't really read in your free time, that's okay. It might be a little bit more of a challenge for you to make your selection, and you might have to think back to some stuff that you read maybe for school. I mean, if you just can't think of many other things, if you have to go back to some previous school scenario, if you have to go back to a book that was assigned in a previous class, I mean, you can do that, but you just want to create brand new material about that text. You don't want to try to reuse anything that you have written about it or had written about it in a previous class. So if you're not a big reader, just do your best, okay? If none of these categories really speak to you, if none of the sort of more contemporary categories speak to you, then you might have to go back and think about something that you read for a class that you didn't hate. But I'm trying to give you a lot of room to choose, so we can try to find something that we like at least a little bit. So once you have selected your text, obviously you need to read it. You need to read it again, even if you have read it before. Okay, and this is very important because, we don't, our minds, the human mind, does not do a great job of retaining the things that we read. So if you remember a book that you read 2 years ago, you really liked it, you want to use it for this assignment, great. And I'm sure that you do remember certain parts of that book. You remember probably the overall, storyline. You might remember the big themes, the big takeaways, but you're going to forget a lot of the details. You're going to forget a lot of the individual scenes, the individual moments, a lot of the individual elements. And that's just natural. That's the way our brains are. We can't really retain everything for an extended period of time. We forget. So even if you think you remember it pretty well, you still need to revisit it and at least reread large parts of it, particularly the parts that you're going to be exploring in your paper. So that's true of a novel. That's true of anything that's long. A really lengthy book can be challenging to write about because there's a lot there. There's a lot to cover. So at the very least, you need to go back to some pivotal moments, reread some really important chapters, but even better would be to reread the entire book. Now, if you choose something shorter, if you choose a short story or a poem, a lot of plays are relatively short. They're at least shorter oftentimes than novels, though not always. Or maybe, a comic or a graphic novel will often be a little shorter than a lot of novels. So if you pick something that is shorter and quicker to get through, you really have no excuse not to read it again, even if you think that you still remember it pretty well. But like I said, you should have already read it once, so you have a foundation. So you have a general idea of what it's about, what it says, and what it does. But then you need to go back, especially if you read it for pleasure. If you read it for fun, chances are you weren't always reading it critically. Chances are you never maybe had to write about it or talk about it in front of a class, and you never had to really analyze it. You were just reading it for fun. Maybe you talked about it casually with some friends, but you never really engaged with it academically like we are now. So you need to go back and start looking for all of the stuff that we care about in this class. You need to spend some time hunting for literary elements. And one strategy, a simple strategy that I hope maybe you guys have picked up by now, but I want to just mention it briefly, is annotating. I don't mean like an annotated bibliography. I mean taking notes while you read, something that good critical readers do. We don't always want to do it, and we're not always going to do it if we're reading for pleasure, because it does slow us down. But when you're reading for something like this, a major assignment like this, a work of literary analysis, you really need to annotate. That just means writing down thoughts, observations, things that occur to you as you read. But you can do a lot of different things with annotations. So generally, I teach this in 101. We underline and annotate sort of together. So as we're reading, we need to be underlining or highlighting important passages, really important moments, like big ideas. Again, I'm teaching this in 101 and 102, and we're often reading nonfiction. But the idea is to underline or highlight anything that seems important, anything that we might need to return to later if we're going to work with this text. And then as we're doing all of that, we're also annotating in the margin. So imagine, I have a book here. I know a lot of us aren't reading old-fashioned books, but if I'm reading, I'm annotating in the margins of the book. If I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is actually a book that I've taught before. So you can see some underlining. I don't know if I have any annotations on this one, but you just write as you read. You write in the margins, and it's very informal. I often use annotations to define words that I don't recognize, or anytime I have to look something up. And this is going to happen. If you're reading a work oftentimes somebody, there might be a reference to a person that you don't know, or an event that you're not familiar with. It might be a real event, it might be a fictional event, but sometimes you can look those things up, certainly if they're real historical events. So if you're looking at a work of history, if you're looking at a work of creative nonfiction, but even a lot of fiction, novels and short stories will often mention, or even poems and plays will mention real events, real things that happen. So if you're not, familiar with that particular historical event, or somebody's name, or a particular word, you don't know what a word means, look it up, and then you can write down the definitions or some brief explanation right next to the word or the reference in the text. Okay, so in the old days, we would mark up our books in English classes. We wouldn't always be able to sell them back because oftentimes we are writing, we are annotating, taking notes as we read. And yeah, it does take a little bit more time. But what you have to remember is, the value of it is that you are creating a record of the important stuff in the text. You're creating a record of what you think. You're finding out what things mean. You're writing down important observations that you might want to work with later. So you are creating a written record that you can return to and use when it's time to actually write the paper. So you're not strictly relying on your memory. If you just try to remember everything off the top of your head, you can only do so much, even if you have a good memory, even if you read the book very recently. The human mind is just not very good at retaining stuff that we read on a page. So underline and annotate. This is also very good when it comes to using textual examples. So I talked a lot about this on the critical responses. I told some of you that you needed more specific examples from the text. Okay, these can be quotes, these can be lines of dialogue spoken by the characters, but these can also just be, or they can be, sections of narration provided by a narrator, or you can just at least summarize something that happens or point to a specific event in the text, and just get specific and talk about or quote things from the text. Those often serve as evidence. They're a big part of how you're going to support your claims, how you're going to support your argument. So again, if you remember 102, this should sound familiar. You had to support a big argument in 102, but that argument was probably about some current event, some controversy or, issue in our society. Now the argument is about the literary text that you choose. But just like you quoted your sources back in 102, you paraphrased your sources, at times you summarized your sources, it's the same thing here. But now with literary analysis at this level, we have two kinds of sources. We have our primary text, and that's the text that you choose, the novel or the poem or the graphic novel that you choose to write about. That's your primary text. And then you're going to do some outside research and find secondary sources. Okay, so you're going to have your primary and your secondary sources. So you can find examples from your primary source, your chosen text, and you can find support and evidence and maybe some other types of examples that you can use from the outside sources that you find. All right, so we're going to have two different sort of sources of information here. But the primary text is always a great place to find examples and support for your claims. So when you're reading and you come across a really important scene or a really pivotal exchange of dialogue between two main characters, those are the kinds of things that you need to underline or highlight or put in brackets. Okay, put a star next to them because you want to come back to those moments. You want to come back to those passages, and you might want to quote from some of those, and you might want to discuss some of those in detail later in your paper. Okay, so that's probably about enough with the reading. Oh yeah, but just one more thing to consider So as you're reading, you're highlighting, you're annotating, you're thinking critically about the text. One other thing that you can use, you can go back to the strategies for analysis, that document that I posted a while back to help us with our critical responses. But it's never too early to start using some of these strategies, or even to start asking yourself some of the questions under where it says questions to spark analysis. Often we do these right after we finish reading. But you can also do some of this while you read, and certainly do some more after you finish. But stuff like surface depth, identifying patterns, identifying opposites, thinking about historical context, a bunch of those strategies that I put in the document, you can do that as you go. You can do a lot of those as you're reading. You don't necessarily have to wait. Now, some of the other strategies like the social relevance or applying a theoretical or critical lens, it's sometimes better to wait a little bit on those, to actually finish the text, have some time to think about it, and then you can start doing some bigger picture stuff, joining the bigger conversation, some of the other things that we talked about. But I would say like the first 4 strategies that I listed, surface depth, patterns, opposites, and context, you can be thinking about those as you read. And you might want to jot down some annotations about those. Also, if you look through those questions, again, I'm just asking you to think about questions about these literary elements, characters, setting, point of view, but then other stuff that we talked about, like irony, time sequence, like how the plot is arranged, specific word choice, sound, like rhyme and meter, if you're reading poetry or a very lyrical song. So we're familiar with all of that stuff. We've talked about all of it, but you can start asking yourself questions about those things as you read. And if you're observing things about characters, about setting, about sound, go ahead and jot them down. Again, when you're annotating at this early stage of the process, it's very informal. Your annotations are not for anyone but you. They are just there to help you. So they don't have to be neat. They don't even have to be, complete thoughts. They can just be little fragments, things that come to you, bullet points, just little brief ideas that you might want to return to. Annotating can really be whatever you want. I wish I had a better book here that I have actually annotated, because you guys could see how I do it. I'm very sloppy. I kind of use like a very general sort of shorthand. You guys probably can't see that, but I put stuff in brackets and I just write little really brief notes, like often like a single word or like a couple of words or like a question, like good, unity, question mark, or I'll just like do things to remind myself about things, especially if I'm reading a really complicated book. Like I just taught this one in an upper level literature class, and it's very complex, the plot. So when I underline or highlight, you can see some of the highlighting there, but a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm reminding myself like who certain people are, or like what's going on in the plot, because it can be hard to keep this stuff straight. It's just like watching a really complicated movie. I think we've all been there. It's like, wait, who is that guy? Like, why are they doing this? Like, I thought that guy was dead. It's sometimes hard to keep up with all of the plot twists and all of the events. So when I'm reading a complicated plot like that, again, this is typically with a novel or maybe a short story, but if it's a complicated plot, even a play too, the script of a play, sometimes I'm just reminding myself, this guy is John's uncle, or this guy hates this other person, right? They're enemies. This guy's trying to kill her, just like things like that. To keep me oriented, to keep me straight as I read. So just stuff like that. Nobody else is going to ever see it or use it. It's just for you. It's to help you understand the text, and it's also to help you remember the most important parts of the text so you can write about that stuff later. So please annotate, underline or highlight, annotate, and once you're finished reading, definitely visit my strategies and make sure that you're using at least some of those strategies and asking some of those questions that you find in the same document. Okay, so I think that's enough about reading, but I really want that to be your first focus. So you can devote most of this week to reading. We're not really writing yet. In fact, I don't want you guys to write really anything this week. We don't have a discussion post. We don't have any other assignments due. So you really shouldn't be writing. This week is about reading and then getting started on research. That's it. Okay? So I'd like you to read first. And once you're finished and you feel like you've been thorough and you have some notes written down and you've looked at my strategies and questions, you can move on to the next thing, which is the research. So again, this is new for us. Another thing that makes this assignment different from our previous assignments, we are doing some research this time around. We're not doing a whole lot. I don't want you guys to spend a whole lot of time doing research, but we're going to be using one or two outside sources to help us make our arguments, like I've been saying. So I want to go back to some things I was discussing a few weeks ago. That sort of the different types of writing that get done about literature. This is when we were first starting to talk about literary criticism and theory. And I was telling you guys that what we're ultimately doing in this class, we're producing literary criticism of our own. That means interpretation and analysis and even some evaluation of literary text. That's what we're doing. But I told you guys that that kind of work can take a few different forms. But we most often see it in the form of scholarly essays. That's what we are writing. That's not really what we were doing before. We were writing short response papers. That's kind of a different genre. Now we are conducting some higher level analysis, and we are producing scholarship. We are producing scholarly essays. That means we are consulting some experts, some scholars, people who work in the field. That's where the research comes in, once again, to provide us with evidence and support. So I really want you guys to think about the research as consisting of two types of texts, two types of sources. Okay. On one hand, we're going to use the GBC library databases and Google Scholar, which is very similar to regular Google, only better, to find scholarly essays and articles written by professors, literary scholars, critics, experts. We're going to find essays and articles like those. Those are going to be very helpful. They're often going to be published in academic journals, literature journals, not necessarily popular publications, not the kind of stuff you're going to find at the checkout aisle, at your local grocery store. These tend to be journals that are read by professors, writers, and advanced English students, people who study literature, like us. So I'm going to give you guys some easy strategies for finding academic or scholarly sources like those. Okay, but one thing that you will need to be able to do on your own is access the GBC library databases. Okay, now I have posted some information in the week 14 module. I've provided some tutorials. If you guys are not clear on how to use the databases, or if you don't know how to log in to the GBC library homepage, you need to watch some of those tutorials. You need to educate yourself a little bit. This is part of your responsibility in 203. because you guys should have learned this in 102. That was, part of your research project, I hope. I know not every 102 class is the same, but by now, you should be able to get into the GBC library. Of course, I mean virtually. We're not actually going to the physical library in Elko. I've only been there once. Most students never step foot in the physical space of the library. You can do all your research online, but you need to be able to log into the library and do some basic searching in the library databases. Okay, and if you don't know how to do that, you got to figure out how to do that. All right, and there's a lot of resources that will help you. If you go to the library homepage, they link you to a lot of instructions and some kind of tutorial, I think, that will show you how to log in. If you don't want to use that, I'm basically providing that same stuff in the week 14 module. So it might take you a little while. You need to be patient. It's not supposed to be hard. You just need to be using your GBC Google account. No matter what device you're on, you need to be logged into your GBC account when you go to the library. And then you should be able to use the same login info that you use for other stuff, I think, like Canvas. And you should be able to gain access. If you're a student at GBC, you should have free access to everything that we have through our library. You just have to log in. And don't be defeated by the login. If you can't do it initially, look at all the resources that are provided for you. And if you still can't figure it out, you might have to call technology services. There's a number available. Again, the library gives you all of that on their homepage. You might have to call somebody. Somebody might have to walk you through a few steps. But even if you have to do that, it's not terribly difficult. Plenty of people do it. We have a pretty helpful technology help desk. They can give you guys what you need if you can't figure it out on your own. But we need to use the library databases, okay, at least a little bit. So once you get in there, there's several different databases that you can use. And we'll talk a little bit more about this next week in case, anybody has questions. Again, I've tried to provide some resources. But if you guys are able to log in, you should be able to see the alphabetical listing of all of our databases. So you can find, any database that you want to use, but the most commonly used ones, and you're going to see these two before you even get into the alphabetical list. As soon as you log in and you're on the database page, you're going to see links to EBSCO, that's EBSCO, and then JSTOR, that's JSTOR. All right, those are the two most commonly used databases in college classes, at least in like humanities classes, English classes, the kind of stuff that we're doing here. So you might have used those in 102. If you took 102 at GBC, these are the databases that I recommend my 102 students use. So they're good. You can find pretty much anything you want in EBSCO or JSTOR. You can certainly find a lot of articles and essays written about your chosen text if your chosen text has been around for a while. So this is where it gets a little bit interesting. So the text that you choose will sort of dictate the types of sources that you find when it comes to your outside sources, your secondary sources that you find through research. If you pick a text that's pretty well known, let's say something that came out, I don't know, in the 80s or the 90s, and you maybe only discovered it a few years ago, but it's been around for 20, 30, 40 years. If it's fairly well known, if it has some fans, if it has some buzz surrounding it, chances are it's been written about. Chances are it's been analyzed both in sort of popular publications, and we're getting to those, don't worry, and also in scholarly academic publications. But that's not always the case. Not all popular books get the academic treatment. That's just the reality. Some things that are really popular sell a lot of copies. they might not get studied by as many critics or scholars because sometimes they're not considered to be serious literature. And a lot of people have a problem with that. And there is some pushback against that kind of an attitude, that kind of separation that's long been made between like literature with a capital L that we typically study in English classes versus stuff like James Patterson, Stephen King, J.K. Rowling, popular authors that probably sell a lot more books than the guys that we often study in English classes, but they're thought of as popular writers. And a lot of times, Hemingway, Catherine Ann Porter, a bunch of the authors we've read, William Gibson, they're considered more to be capital L literature writers. But again, those distinctions don't mean as much now as they meant when I was in college. They're not as important now as they were 20, 30 years ago. So don't be discouraged. It's okay if you can't really find a lot of academic sources about your text, but I want you to at least look. I want you to see what's out there. So you can search in EBSCO or JSTOR. You can just search the title of your book. That's easy, but that's a place to start. You can also search for your author. You can search the author's name, see what's been written about that author, see what's out there about the author. But you can also try some other search terms. If you're looking for stuff that's specifically about a particular character or a particular theme or a particular aspect of historical context, you can get more specific in your searches. And you can use those Boolean operators. I don't know if you guys remember those from 102. But basically, you can just use like a plus sign or the word and to link together different phrases or words that you want to search for together. So like if you're searching for a particular thing, like a particular, historical event or even a particular character or something in your text, you can type that thing in along with maybe the title of your text, connecting them with a Boolean, and you might be able to get some search results that way. So you can play around with some different phrases, some different terms, try some different searches, and see what you find. But if your text is recent, like if it came out just a few years ago, or if it came out like last year, people haven't had as much time to write articles and essays about it, so there might be a little bit less out there. That's okay. Another database that you might want to use, especially when we're doing literary research, is MLA International Bibliography. So if you want to search for that in the alphabetical listing, just go to the M's. Go to the M's and you'll see MLA. That stands for Modern Language Association. That's a very important sort of body in the world of English. The MLA International Bibliography, that's sort of the one-stop shop for literary research, okay? So when you get in there, everything you find for the most part is going to come from literature journals, academic literature journals that, again, are used by people like me, and advanced English students. So just a few examples. These are some of the titles that you might see if you're using MLA and if you're doing these kinds of searches. You might find articles in journals like New Literary History, American Literary History, Contemporary Literature. These are all different ones. The Journal of Modern Literature. The Journal of Literary Theory. Remember, I said theory and criticism aren't quite the same. Sometimes we can find articles and books that are about literary theory, often stuff like structuralism or post-structuralism, but maybe not as focused on specific texts, but more about larger ideas, larger theories connected to texts. So you might find some stuff like that. The Journal of Post-Colonial Writing. We talked about post-colonialism as an approach, a critical approach. There's a whole journal sort of devoted to that critical approach. There's also one just called American Literature, Language and Literature. There's a bunch out there. Okay, the Arizona Quarterly is another one that's kind of close to where we are geographically. So if you come across articles in any journal, any of those journals that I just listed, you're in good hands. That's going to be a good source written by a scholar, somebody who knows a lot about the text and about literature in general. Okay, so I want everybody to spend at least a little bit of time, go inside the library databases, check out EBSCO, maybe JSTOR, and certainly MLA, International Bib. Use those databases, see what's out there about your chosen text. Now, the other way we can go with our research is what we might consider to be more popular publications and what we would probably think of as book reviews. So remember, I mentioned book reviews back when we started on literary criticism. I said they're kind of related to criticism and theory, but they're different. Book reviews are usually geared more towards evaluation and recommending books rather than analyzing. But for our purposes, we can still use book reviews. They can still be helpful for us. So you're often going to find book reviews in newspapers, magazines, and sometimes those newspapers and magazines will have websites. And that's fine. So I just wanted to kind of give you a few examples of places where you can find good book reviews. Again, a lot of these are newspapers, and then sometimes you'll find them in just what are called like review publications, like all they do is book reviews. I've actually put a link in the week 14 module. If you guys want to check some more of these out, that's a link to just a long list of places where you can find book reviews. And they're organized based on whether they come from newspapers or just review publications. So you can see two different lists, and there's links provided to each one. So you can visit their websites. You can search for your text. Once you get on their websites, you can normally search for the title of your text and just see if anybody has reviewed it on that site. And these are pretty good. So the New York Times has a pretty famous book review section. Some other newspapers that we've probably heard of, the Boston Globe, USA Today is a big one. But then there's some other just like review publications that are easy to find. The Kirkus Review. You'll see that one on the site that I've linked you to. The Boston Review, the American Book Review, the San Francisco Book Review. If you go to sites like those, you'll find good reviews. They'll be a little bit shorter. They're not necessarily going to be scholarly. You'll notice a difference between a book review in a newspaper versus an academic article in a literature journal. You'll notice a lot of differences in terms of length, in terms of style. Book reviews don't typically have citations, like they're not typically citing their sources, a little bit more opinion based, and like I said, a little bit more focused on evaluating a text and recommending it. Hey, go out and read it. It's great. Whereas what you find in an academic journal, something like New Literary History or American Literature, you're going to find scholarship, right? You're going to find more rigorous analysis. You're going to see more consideration of literary elements and stuff like irony and paradox. You're going to see more critical approaches, certain critical lenses like feminism or post-colonialism or new historicism. And you might even find some journals, like I said, that are devoted to one particular critical approach, like the Journal of Post-Colonial Writing. So, just two different styles of source. Both can work. And typically, if you're using a very recent text, like I said, if you're choosing something that came out recently, there might not be a lot of scholarship or a lot of academic articles written about it, but chances are, if it's somewhat popular and successful, it's probably been reviewed by one of these major review publications or one of these big newspapers that have book review sections. Almost any major newspaper, like the Las Vegas newspaper, LA newspaper, San Francisco newspaper, almost any major newspaper will have book reviews. And a lot of magazines have them too. So those are also options, particularly for contemporary sources that don't have a lot of other stuff written about them, okay? But those are your two choices, okay? You can go the academic route and use stuff from those literary journals, or you can use book reviews, all right? There's not really a ton of other sources that I want you guys to use, and I specifically want you guys to avoid certain kinds of sources. So I want you to avoid stuff like Goodreads or Book Riot. I know those are book review websites, but those reviews are provided by just users, just like regular people, readers, not necessarily experts, not the kinds of scholars or experts that you get with academic articles. And even with book reviews, those are usually written by journalists who have spent their careers covering arts and entertainment. So professionals, at the very least, even if they're not scholars necessarily, they are professionals in that field. When you go to Goodreads, you're going to see reviews, but they're written by just anybody. So they're not always reliable. Sometimes you're going to find some smart takes, some pretty good interpretations, but it's kind of like Wikipedia. You just can't really rely on what you find there. You're going to find some good stuff. Even in Wikipedia, there's some good info there. But you can't use it as a source because it's an open source, which means anybody can post information to it. So that the same goes for those kinds of like user-generated review websites. Those just aren't going to be very helpful for us. And we also don't want to use summary websites. I've already mentioned this a little bit in reference to the critical responses, but the same holds true here on the final paper. You don't need summary websites. No Course Hero. No eNotes. All right? None of those websites that basically specialize in doing students' work for them. Sites that will give you papers to buy. Sites that might give you a free preview of some already existing analysis. I know we've all probably used those in the past. I'm not necessarily free of guilt there in my own past academic life, but that stuff doesn't give us good material for analysis. It just doesn't. I can't stop you from visiting those sites. And if you're confused about something that happens in the plot of your novel, then I guess you can go and read a summary just for your own clarification. I can't stop you from doing that. I don't think that's necessary if you're reading well and you're underlining and annotating. But if you want to do that and you feel like you need to do that, I obviously won't stop you. But that summary that you read just to get everything straight in your own mind, that summary does not need to make any sort of appearance in your final paper. It's not a source. It's not something that you should be quoting. It's not something that you should be directly using in your paper. Okay? So I can't control what websites you visit, but do not use those kinds of summary websites on the paper. Like I said, we use a plagiarism detection program that will tell me if stuff is getting lifted from websites or even if stuff looks similar to the stuff found on websites. So I can kind of get a pretty good idea of what sites you guys are using. So if I can see that it's Course Hero, that's not good. If I can see that it's the New York Times book review website, that's fine. That's a good website to be on. If you're on the San Francisco book review, USA Today book review, or you're pulling something from an academic article, those are good. Okay? eNotes, Course Hero, Goodreads, not good for the kind of work that we're doing. Not good and really not acceptable. They're not going to be acceptable as sources. So the final thing I was going to mention is just Google Scholar. Okay, another way to find good sources on literary text, and you can find a lot of the same stuff that you would find in MLA International Bib or EBSCO, but you can do it without going to the library databases. So if you just go to Google and you search for Google Scholar, you'll be on a new place where you can conduct some searches. It looks just like Google, but the difference is Google Scholar will only give you academic or scholarly search results. Okay, so with a typical Google search, you will have some good hits in there, but you're also going to have a bunch of other stuff that's less useful. But with Google Scholar, all your results are going to be academic, scholarly articles or books. So a lot of the stuff coming from those literary journals that I mentioned, but also books written by critics or scholars, you're going to be able to find a lot of full text access to those sources through Google Scholar. You'll often find links to PDFs. You might be able to download or even print some of those files. So Google Scholar is another avenue that's worth exploring. You'll be able to find some good sources through that as well. So between the library databases, Google Scholar, and the book review links that I've provided you with in the Week 14 module, you should have everything that you need for research. And I do think I want everybody to have 2 sources. I think that's the number I put in the assignment direction. So what often works well is to get 1 academic source from the library databases and then 1 book review from a newspaper that's a little bit lighter, shorter, easier to read. It's a nice balance. I have a lengthy academic article with a lot of great analysis that can help me, stuff I can use as evidence, and then a short book review that might just give me 1 or 2 things that I can use, but also helpful. Okay? So start reading and start researching this week. And as you research, even when you're not using, some of the stuff that you're not using can still help you learn more about your text. You can learn a little bit more about what people are saying about it. Was it well received by critics? Did it get good reviews? You can read a bunch of book reviews. You don't have to use them all as sources. You can just read a few to get a feel for what people are saying about this text. What do people think about it? What kind of impact is it having in the world? So just educate yourself a little bit about this text. Read it first, and then read what people are saying and writing about it. Start that research process, see what's out there. If you have questions or problems, let me know. And I will see you next week for the final lecture of the semester. I really will try to keep that one brief because it's just about writing our papers. So we're mostly writing next week, and we can also think a little bit about post-writing. That means revising and editing our rough drafts and turning them into final drafts so we can submit during exam week. Okay, so if you have any questions, get in touch with me, and I will see you guys for the last time next week.